Burial and the origins of human culture. Imagine you're standing over a body, someone you knew, maybe someone you loved, and the rest of the group is watching you, waiting to see what you do. There's no ritual here, no tradition. No one has ever done this before. The animals are close. You can smell them at the edge of the tree line, drawn by the scent. And you have a decision to make right now, in the next few minutes, about what happens to this person. Do you leave? Do you move the body? Do you stay and fight off anything that comes? For most of human history, that wasn't a philosophical question. It was a survival problem. And the answer that early humans eventually landed on changed something much deeper than anyone expected. We didn't always bury our dead. That's easy to forget. For hundreds of thousands of years, the evidence suggests that most human groups did what most other animals do. They left the body behind. They moved on. Grief, if it existed in any recognizable form, didn't stop the group from functioning. You couldn't let it. A carcass draws predators. Predators kill people. Sentiment is expensive when your margin for survival is already razor thin. So the default wasn't burial. The default was abandonment. And then, at some point, something shifted. The oldest unambiguous evidence of intentional burial comes from a site in Israel called Qafzeh Cave. Bodies found there were deliberately placed in pits, with their limbs arranged dating to roughly 100,000 years ago. But there's a site that pushes back even further. At Sima de los Huesos in Spain, which translates to Pit of the Bones, archaeologists found the skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals, all deposited in the same shaft deep inside a cave system, dating to around 430,000 years ago. These weren't random deaths. Getting a body that deep into a cave takes effort. It takes intention. Someone carried those people in there on purpose. Here's where it gets complicated. The Sima de los Huesos hominins weren't even fully modern humans. They were a related species, possibly early Neanderthals, or a common ancestor, which means the impulse to do something deliberate with the dead didn't start with us. It started before us. And that changes the entire question. We used to ask why humans started burying their dead. The better question might be why this behavior kept showing up independently across different species, different continents, and different time periods, as if something deep and biological was pulling groups toward it. One leading explanation is purely practical. A decomposing body is a disease vector. Bacteria, flies, scavengers carrying pathogens back into camp. A group that habitually cleared bodies away from the living area would have had a measurable survival advantage. This isn't speculation. Modern epidemiology confirms it. Exposure to decomposing remains increases infection risk in exactly the kinds of environments early humans were living in. So natural selection may have quietly rewarded the groups that handled their dead with some kind of removal. Burial was just the most thorough version of that. But here's the problem with stopping there. Because if removal was all this was about, you'd expect shallow dumps. Bodies dropped in rivers, left at the edge of camp, shoved into a crevice. You wouldn't expect grave goods. And yet, at sites going back 100,000 years, we find them. At Qafzeh, a child was buried with the antlers of a fallow deer placed across the body. At Sungir, in Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, a man was buried wearing a garment decorated with roughly 3,000 mammoth ivory beads, each one individually carved and drilled. The beads alone would have taken somewhere between 10,000 and 45,000 hours to produce. That's not hygiene, that's ceremony. That's belief. The pattern becomes even more striking when you consider the consistency. Across continents and millennia, we see the same impulse expressed in different materials and styles. In Africa, shells are pierced and placed with burials. In Australia, ochre is applied with precision. In Europe, flint tools are positioned at a deceased person's hands. The variation suggests these practices weren't learned from a single source or copied from neighboring groups. They were invented independently, which means different human populations, living in different environments, separated by vast distances and time, all arrived at the same behavioral conclusion. If this were just about disease control, you wouldn't expect such widespread ceremony. You'd expect pragmatism. Instead, what you see across every continent is people investing time and resources into the dead in ways that had no practical payoff. That suggests the practical explanation, while real, was never the whole story. And the Neanderthals make this even harder to dismiss. For decades, researchers debated whether Neanderthals actually buried their dead, or whether bodies in Neanderthal sites were just preserved by coincidence. Then Shanidar Cave in Iraq changed the conversation. A Neanderthal individual found there, called Shanidar I, showed healed injuries so severe that researchers believe this person survived for years with a withered arm, a damaged eye, and significant hearing loss. That kind of survival requires group support. Long-term deliberate care for someone who couldn't fully contribute. That's not just biology, that's empathy operating as a social system. Now, you might be thinking the grave flowers at Shanidar settled it. For a while, researchers believed pollen found around the body proved Neanderthals placed flowers on their dead. More recent analysis suggested the pollen may have been carried in by burrowing rodents. So we can't make that claim confidently anymore. But the larger point stands. A group that kept a severely disabled member alive for years was clearly capable of valuing individuals beyond their immediate usefulness. The leap from that to deliberate burial isn't as large as it used to seem. And then there's the ochre. Red ochre shows up in burial contexts across Africa, Europe, and Asia tens of thousands of years before writing, before agriculture, before anything we'd recognize as civilization. At Lake Mungo in Australia, a burial dating to roughly 42,000 years ago was found covered in powdered red ochre. The body had also been cremated. That's two separate deliberate acts. Someone burned the body, gathered the remains, covered them in pigment, and interred them in the ground. We have no idea what the ochre meant to them, but it clearly meant something. That's the moment the question stops being about sanitation and starts being about something we still don't fully understand. Because ochre has no practical function in a burial. It doesn't preserve the body. It doesn't protect the living. It's a symbolic act, which means it requires symbolic thought. It requires the ability to attach meaning to an object and then transfer that meaning onto a ritual. That's a cognitive leap, and it's the same leap that produces art, language, mythology, and religion. Burial might not just be evidence of those things. It might be one of the places where they started. Consider what this shift in thinking represents. The ability to use one thing to represent something else is foundational to human thought. It's how we created language, where sounds represent objects and ideas. It's how we make art, where pigment on a wall represents an animal or a vision. And it's how we developed all abstract thinking. Once you can do that with ochre at a burial, you can do it anywhere. You can make symbols that mean things to your group. You can accumulate those symbols and meanings across time. You can build an entire system of shared understanding that exists purely in the minds of people who've agreed that these marks mean something specific. That's culture in its most essential form. Think about what the act requires. You have to recognize that a person is gone. Recognizing death and then continuing to assign significance to the body days or weeks later, that requires a persistent mental representation of that individual. It requires memory operating across time. And when you extend that forward, you get something even more interesting. If you're burying someone with objects they used in life, with food, with tools, with decorations, that implies you believe those things still matter to them, which implies you believe something continues. You're not just disposing of remains, you're sending someone somewhere. That's belief in an afterlife, and it's written into the archaeological record 100,000 years ago, maybe much earlier. At La Chapelle-aux-Sens in France, a Neanderthal was found in a pit that appears deliberately dug, surrounded by animal bones and tools. Whether that was intentional or incidental has been debated ever since the original 1908 excavation. But there's a site that's unmistakable. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, 3 individuals were buried together roughly 31,000 years ago, their heads touching, one of them covered with mammoth shoulder blades. The deliberate arrangement is undeniable. What makes these burial sites remarkable is their consistency across time. For tens of thousands of years, the basic elements don't change much. A pit or grave, objects placed with care. Sometimes ochre, sometimes pigment, sometimes nothing but positioning. The stability of these practices suggests they weren't fads or experiments. They were solutions that worked, that felt right to people, that got passed down because they expressed something important. Communities that knew how to do this, that had the ritual knowledge and the motivation to execute it, would have had stronger internal cohesion. They would have had a shared understanding of what mattered, and that understanding, encoded in how they treated their dead, would have been inherited by the next generation and the next, becoming stronger with repetition. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Burial creates a fixed point in space. A grave is a location. It's a place you return to. And a place you return to is a place that builds meaning over time. A place that ties a group to a landscape, that says we were here and someone we cared about is still here. That's territorial in a way that's completely different from just defending a hunting ground. It's territorial in a way that starts to look like home. Some researchers have argued that the development of formal burial grounds may have been one of the earliest mechanisms for establishing land tenure. Your dead are here. This is your land. Not because you're stronger than the next group, but because you have history here. You have roots here, and that logic compounds across generations. Every new burial at an existing site reinforces the connection between the living group and that piece of ground, which means the dead weren't just remembered. They were doing something. They were anchoring communities to places, accumulating social weight across time, binding the living to each other through shared obligation to those already gone. The graves weren't just where people put the dead. They were where the community kept its memory. And a group with shared memory, with stories about who came before and what they did, is a group that can coordinate across time in ways that groups without that memory simply can't. So what started as a response to death turned into one of the foundational structures of human society. And somewhere in there, in all the grief and the ceremony and the ochre and the ivory beads, something that looks remarkably like culture was quietly assembling itself around the